if you've been online lately, you know that basically everyone is talking about Stranger Things. But if you didn't know, Stranger Things takes inspiration from a supposedly true story. It is about a program called MK Ultra. Basically, the CIA set it up because they were trying to develop a mind control drug for war. American officials ran hundreds of experiments to see if they could change the way people thought and felt too. Lots of times they dosed random civilians with LSD without telling them. Now, operatives in this group would pretend to be doctors prescribing medicine to people, and then their patients would take acid. They slipped acid into lunches that were served in particular schools and hospitals. Now, once the victim would begin hallucinating, CIA agents would come to the apartment to study him, and then the officials would pay the sex worker for her help. But on top of this, they also tricked people into letting them perform electroshock therapy or hypnosis on them. And when the unwitting test subjects were in these experiments, they often hallucinated, became very confused, experienced paranoia and psychosis. And at least one person did take his own life during one of these bad trips that he wasn't even aware was happening. So all this to say, this was a horrible, shocking, and ultimately deadly government program, and it didn't even work. The CIA never found a method to brainwash people or rewrite their personalities. And again, I want to emphasize, the CIA has confirmed all of this. MK Ultra is a historical fact. They released all of the information they had on the program in the late 1970s, but of course, it's impossible to say how much more data never even saw the light of day. Now you can see how much this real CIA program shaped Stranger Things' narrative if you've watched it. The main difference is that officially the MK Ultra experiments didn't work, but obviously in Stranger Things, the doctors successfully turned Eleven into a psychic weapon. They were inspired by another tinfoil tale, and this one has an even bigger influence on the Netflix show. This is called the Montauk Project. And unlike MK Ultra, this one has not been officially confirmed by the government. And I can't tell the story about the Montauk Project without also telling you about a man named Preston Nichols. He was a devoted scientist who loved dabbling in electronics and inventing new devices. And here's what he said. At some point in history, during the Cold War, Preston was able to pick up a strange radio signal using some equipment that he had designed. And he realized it was a secret transmission from the Soviet Union. Now, before long, a military contractor reached out to him with a job. Again, this part's all true. Now, these military contractors wanted to know if telepathy, a fancy word for mind reading, was real. So Preston was put in charge of a study where he tested different people to see if they had psychic powers. Now, Preston came on board thinking he was actually going to prove that telepathy wasn't real. According to him, his book doesn't go into much detail about what exactly he learned, but it does say that the experiments were a resounding success, and he found people with real mind reading abilities. As he was running his study, he noticed something odd. Every single day at the same time each day, everyone's telepathy powers would suddenly go away. And it was obvious to Preston that something was interfering with his experiment. So he built a machine that could detect radio waves on a particular frequency. And sure enough, it showed that every day when everyone's telepathy stopped working, there was a huge blast on that wavelength. So his next step was to try and figure out what direction it was coming from, who was broadcasting it, where is this coming from? Drove around until he found the source of the signal. And sure enough, he tracked it to the nearest Air Force base, which was in a small town in Long Island called Montauk. This base had a huge radio tower in the middle of it. Sadly, this meant that his experiment couldn't go much further from there, and according to him, eventually his study ended. But then, over a decade later, in 1984, he finally had the chance to learn more. That year, the Air Force officially decommissioned the base. Sure enough, when he drove out to the base a short while later, he realized he didn't even need to break in. The gates had been left open. He began making frequent visits to Montauk, and each time he'd gather papers, examine the abandoned technology, and study everything he could get his hands on. Now, during one of these visits, he came across a dirty man in ragged clothes. This random man claimed to know him. The man said Preston had done some kind of psychic experiment on him on the base. And then that November, it was like history was repeating itself. This time, a man named Duncan Cameron reached out to Preston because he had heard about Preston's knack for engineering. Preston was fascinated with Duncan, and out of curiosity, he invited Duncan to come to the Montauk base with him. Well, reportedly, as soon as they reached the base, Duncan goes into some kind of trance. He's awake, his eyes are open, but it was like he couldn't see or hear anything around him. And that's when Duncan told Preston, "I've actually met you before, a long time ago." He said Preston had been running an experiment on the base involving telepathy and mind reading. Duncan added, "The reason I can read minds so well now, like why you're picking this up from me, is because I was one of the subjects in your study." Both of the men were forced to forget about the work they had done at Montauk. Now, the good news was that Preston actually knew how to unlock repressed memories. Apparently, he needed to learn this skill during his other experiments with psychics, the ones he still remembered. So, according to Preston, in the 1960s and 70s, Preston reportedly worked on the base with a team of scientists. Their job was to find children with psychic abilities, bring them onto the base, and train them to use their powers to help the U.S. military. During this time, Preston got to know one of the children they were experimenting on. That child's name? Duncan. He knew the work that Duncan was doing was very dangerous as a child. It was also exhausting, especially when Duncan had to sit in the so-called Montauk chair. According to Preston, whenever anyone sat in this chair, it would make their thoughts visible. And if the person concentrated hard enough, their thoughts would become physically real, like an actual apple or butterfly or sock would manifest into existence because of this child's power. Back in the day, before their memories were erased, Duncan and Preston made a plan together. They would use the power of the Montauk chair to shut down the experiment forever. Now, the next time Duncan had to sit in the Montauk chair, his handlers told him to think of an object. He imagined the scariest, biggest, most violent monster he could think of. The monster appeared somewhere on the base, and it killed many of the scientists who were running the experiment and then sped across the grounds looking for more victims. Now, at that point, the Air Force decided they had no choice but to shut down the project because it had gone too far. They abandoned the base, physically erased the memory of everyone involved with the experiments, and then moved on. The story, along with the confirmed MK Ultra, have inspired people to ask themselves what they should believe and whether they can trust their government leaders. If this is true for you, that you are skeptical, it is worth noting. Since 1984, Camp Hero has been open to the public. Even though Camp Hero hasn't been operational in decades, huge chunks of it are off limits to the public. Unofficially, though, some people think there are still strange creatures who live in Montauk. I'll also note that in the summer of 2008, a group of civilians discovered the carcass of an unidentified creature on a beach near the base. And that was the true story behind the hit Netflix show Stranger Things. Thank you so much for going into this dark history with me today, and I will see you next time with another one. Goodbye.